This is a follow-up to a previous video which explained how to get data from multiple closed Excel files. The technique we used in that video was to connect to each of the Excel files in turn, load the contents of the file into a record set, and then write the contents of the record set out into a worksheet. That technique works really well when the files you're connecting to have different numbers of columns with different names and different types. But when the files you're connecting to all have the same columns, there's something of a shortcut we can take, and this video is going to explain how that works. To get started, I've got an almost empty workbook. It's just got some column headings written into the top of sheet 1. I'll make this file available for download, by the way, so you can use the exact same data that I'm working with. And I've saved that workbook in the same folder as a subfolder called My Files, and that subfolder contains all of the files we're going to connect to and extract the data from. Each of these files just contains a list of films made in a particular year, and the column headings in each of those files matches exactly the column headings of the file we're going to load them into. So to get started, I'm going to head into the Visual Basic Editor from my empty or almost empty workbook, insert a new module into the project, and then create a new subroutine in here called Get Data from Multiple Files. We're going to be using the Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects library for this example, so to make sure we get plenty of help from the IntelliSense as we write our code, let's set a reference to the ActiveX Data Objects library first. We can do that by heading up to the Tools menu and choosing References, and then scrolling down through the list to find Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects. There should be several different versions installed on your machine. Just go with whichever the latest version you have available is. So in my case, that's the 6.1 library. Having done that, I can click OK, and then I can declare my first variable using a class defined in that library. So I'm going to create a variable called cn as an adodb.connection. I can then create a new instance of that class by saying set cn equals new adodb.connection, and then I'll set the most important property of the connection object, its connection string. So cn.connectionString equals, then I'll just open and close a set of double quotes for the moment because I'm not going to write out my connection string from scratch. I'm going to rely on my usual trick of heading over to the connectionstrings.com website and then find the specific connection string I need for the particular version of Excel I'm using. So I'll click on the link for Excel and then choose a provider or a driver. In this case, I'll go with a Microsoft ACE OLEDB12 provider. And then I can scroll down through the list which appears to find the closest match for the version of Excel that I'm using. I believe the last listed version on this page is Excel 2013. And it's important to make sure we pick the connection string for the type of Excel file we're connecting to. So obviously I'm writing my code in a macro-enabled workbook, but the files I'm connecting to are XLSX files. And there are slightly different connection strings for each type of Excel file, so you'll find the macro-enabled one a bit further down the list there. Anyway, in this case, I'm going to highlight the connection string for the XLSX files, copy that to the clipboard, head back to the VB editor, and then paste that in inside those double quotes. Now, obviously, we need to do a bit of tidying up here. We can't just leave it like that. We've got a few bits of information we need to change. So to help with that, I'm just going to split this across multiple lines using the space underscore continuation character. So I'll take the provider down to the next line and then indent that one space. I've got the provider set correctly there, and the provider property ends just at the semicolon, the first semicolon character in the string. I'm going to close some double quotes there and then concatenate that with the space underscore continuation character, and then take the data source down to the next line and open up some more double quotes. Then the data source ends at the next semicolon character, so I'll close some more double quotes there, concatenate that with another space underscore continuation character, and then open some more double quotes at the beginning of the next line for the extended properties property. We have a couple of things we need to sort out after that then. If I click onto the next line, of course, I begin with a syntax error, and the reason for the syntax error is this nested set of double quotes within the wider string of the connection string. I can't nest double quote characters within a set of double quotes. I've got two choices to solve these. I can either double up my double quotes, like so. That works. I prefer personally using single quotes instead. I think it looks a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to change my double quotes for single quotes. And that will solve the syntax error at least. The next thing I want to do is set the connection string to point to just one specific file in the My Files folder. So at this point, of course, that folder path there is not the correct one. So I'm just going to adjust this slightly. I'm going to highlight C:\my folder, my Excel 2007 file, and then remove that from the string, and then close some double quotes after the data source equals, and then I'll use the ampersand character to concatenate that with this workbook.path, and then concatenate that with, and then open up some more double quotes, \my files, another \, and then I'll go for the movies 2011 workbook with the .xlsx extension to begin with. So clicking away from that line just proves that I don't have any more syntax errors. So the first example we'll go for is to connect to the first file in that folder using its explicit name. Finally, just as a quick way to check that we've got the connection string set up correctly, I'd like to try to open and then close down the connection. So I'm going to say cn.open, and then a few blank lines, and cn.close a little further down towards the end of the subroutine. Of course, we'll add in some more interesting lines of code in between these two eventually, but just for now, I'm going to use the F8 key to begin stepping through this procedure. And if we reach the cn.open instruction and we can execute that without causing any kind of error, then things are looking pretty good. So I've connected to the file, I've opened it up, I can close the connection again and then end the subroutine. Next, I'd like to try to return all of the data from sheet 1 of the file we've just connected to. And to help with that, I'll declare two new variables. The first one's going to be called rs as an adodb.recordset. And the second one, just to help us out with something we need to do later on, I'll declare a variable called SQL string as a string, and we'll use that to hold the select statement that will select all of the data from sheet 1. I'm going to set the value of the SQL string variable just after we've set the connection string. So I'm going to say SQL string equals, and then in some double quotes, select star or asterisk. The asterisk there represents every single column from, and then the name of the worksheet that holds the data. All of the workbooks in the My Files folder have a single worksheet called Sheet 1. And to specify that, we can open some square brackets, say Sheet 1 followed by a $, and then close the square brackets. Having done that, after I've opened up my connection, I'd like to create a new instance of the Recordset class. So I'll say set rs equals new adodb.recordset. And then there are two properties I want to change for the record set. First of all, rs.activeConnection. I want that to be equal to the only connection we have available, so that's called cn. And then rs.source, which will be equal to the value of the SQL string variable. Again, just to check that this is actually going to work without causing any errors, what I'd like to do then is try to open the record set by saying rs.open, and then we'll add some more interesting code in between. But before we do that, let's say rs.close before we close the connection. And again, if we use the F8 key to step through at this point, providing we can open the record set without causing any errors, looks good to me. Things seem to be working quite well. Okay, now let's add the code that will write the contents of the record set out into the worksheet in this workbook called Sheet 1, starting from cell A2. To do that, we can add a new line in between rs.open and rs.close. I'll refer to the worksheet using its code name just for convenience, and then say range a2.copy from record set. And all I have to do then is specify the record set that contains the data I want to write out. So there's only one available, it's called rs. So having done that, I can just run the subroutine. And if I look back at my worksheet back in Excel, I should find that it's now full of all the data from sheet 1 of the 2011 workbook. Now, because I'm going to be running this subroutine multiple times, I want to make sure that this set of data gets cleared out again each time I run the subroutine. So to do that, I'm going to refer to range A1 and then the current region property of range A1, which is effectively like pressing Ctrl and A to highlight the entire region, and then shift that selection down by one row and then clear the entire contents of the worksheet except for the header row. So to do that, we can head back to the Visual Basic Editor. and I'll add this new line just after my list of variable declarations. I'll say sheet1.range a1.current_region.offset 1 row down and 0 columns to the right .clear. So if I were stepping through this subroutine step by step, if I use the F8 key, we should see that in the background we clear the contents of that worksheet first, apart from the header row, and then we can populate the record set, write out its contents into the worksheet again, and then close the record set and close the connection. For the next part of this technique, I'd like to show you how you can put multiple select statements together to form one big list of results, all returned by one single record set. The first example we'll do here is a little bit unusual. I just want to create a duplicate of the exact same set of data we've just used here with select star from sheet 1. So in fact, I'm just going to copy that part of the string. And then, still inside the double quotes here, I'm going to use the union all keywords and then paste in select star from sheet 1. So at the moment, if I look back at my results, I've got 10 rows of films, Harry Potter down to Cars 2. But if I run this subroutine now and look back at the results, I've got 2 copies of those results. The reason I've used union all here, by the way, you can use just the union keyword, but watch what happens if I do this. If I take away the all keyword, union doesn't display duplicated records. So because we were getting exact copies of everything, if I just used union, I'd still return just those 10 results. If you wanted to eliminate duplicates from your result set, then use union. If you want to make sure you get all the duplicates as well, then we can use union all. Now, of course, selecting duplicate sets of data from the same table isn't quite what we want to do. We do want to select everything from sheet 1, but for the second select statement, we want to select everything from sheet 1 in one of the other files in this list. Just to demonstrate this next part, I'm going to use Movies 2012 as an example. So for the second select statement in the SQL string variable, we can say select star from sheet 1 in, and then in a set of single quotes, we can write out the full path and file name of the file containing the table of data that we want to get. Now, I'm not going to write out the full folder path to that file. What I'm going to do is cheat a little bit and just use what I've already put into the connection string, this workbook.path and my files, movies2011.xlsx. I'll copy that to the clipboard at this point. And then at the end of my SQL string line, I'm going to concatenate a space underscore. And on the next line, paste in what I've just copied and then close a set of single quotes after xlsx and then close a set of double quotes as well. Now, of course, I'll also need to change the file name from 2011 to 2012. And there's one last little thing I'll need to do. At this point, just referring to the file and folder path isn't quite sufficient. At this point, if I try to run the subroutine, it's going to fail, unable to find or work out what type of database format that file is. So there's one additional thing we need to do at the end of that string as a bare minimum. I'll type in another space, and then inside a set of single quotes, we can specify what format that file is in. So I can copy here the XL 12.0 XML semicolon character, paste that in inside those single quotes, and then when I run the subroutine this time and look back at the results on the worksheet, we've now got a list of films from 2011 and 2012, but without creating an explicit connection to the second file. So that's working okay so far, but from this point I don't want to have to manually add every other file and folder path for each other file in this folder. There could be hundreds of files in there, I don't want to have to do that much work. So what we're going to do instead is build up to looping through the collection of files in this folder, extracting the file name for each one, and then building up our full SQL string in a loop. Just to help get started with that, I'm going to declare a couple of extra variables. So after my SQL string variable, I'm going to say dim my file's path as string, and then I'll say dim movie file name also as a string. Then I'll set my file's path to be equal to this workbook.path and the my files folder. So my files path equals, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this again from my existing code. So this workbook.path and my files, and then just close the double quotes at the end of that line. And then for the first movie file name, I'm going to use the dir or directory function to try to find the first file with the XLSX extension in that folder. So I'm going to say movie file name equals dir, and then open up some round brackets and pass in my files path, and then concatenate to that a wildcard search string, so an asterisk character, .xlsx. So that's any file name with the .xlsx extension. Now I'm assuming that that's going to return the path to a file, or the name of a file I should say. I'm pretty confident that there are files in that folder, but do bear in mind that if there are no files that match that pattern in the folder you've specified, the directory function returns an empty string, so that could cause problems later on in your code, so just be aware of that. Now that I've done that, I'm just going to modify my connection string, because I don't need to any longer say this workbook.path and my files movies 2011.xlsx. What I can do instead is put together the my files path and the movie file name variables to always set my connection string to the first file that we find in the folder we're looping through. So let's take away this workbook.path and the rest of that part. I'll just close that set of double quotes, sorry, beg pardon, open that set of double quotes there to enclose the semicolon character. And then after the ampersand, I'm going to say my files path, and then concatenate that with movie file name, again, assuming that we do have a file name in that variable, and then concatenate that with the semicolon character at the end. So we haven't changed too much just yet, but this is setting us up for some more useful things we can do in a moment. But just to check that I haven't broken anything at this point, let's run the subroutine and make sure that we still end up with our list of 2011 and 2012 films. Next, I'd like to build the loop that will carry on searching for Excel files in the same folder until we run out of Excel files to find. The only line of code that I want to include inside that loop at this point is the one that builds our SQL string. So just before that line, I'm going to say do until movie file name equals an empty string. So we're basically going to rely on the fact that the dir function returns an empty string when it can't find the file you're looking for. I'll just then include or indent that pair of lines, the SQL string construction. And then before we open the connection, I'll say loop. And before we loop back to the top, I want to try to find the next Excel file. And to do that, I can just say movie file name equals dir. So when you don't pass any parameters or any values to any of the parameters of the dir function, it just continues using the original search pattern for the next file in the folder. So that little section there will loop around until it runs out of Excel files to find. Just to test that this part is working and to avoid writing anything out into my worksheet, I'm just going to highlight all of the lines of code below the loop to the end of the subroutine and then comment all of those lines out in one go. If you don't have this toolbar displayed, by the way, the toolbar displayed there is the Edit toolbar, so you can right click on any existing toolbar or menu and choose to display the Edit toolbar for the comment block button. I'll also then print out the name of the movie file so that we can see that something actually is happening. So I'll say debug.print movie file name. The SQL string will be constructed again. It's kind of irrelevant at this point. It's not being used anywhere, but I'll leave that in place just for now. And then if I run my subroutine, I should just end up with a list of all of the workbook names sitting in that folder. Next, let's look at building up our SQL string for each file that we encounter. This is a little tricky because we need to do something different for the first file that we encounter. That just needs to be a very basic select star from sheet 1, whereas each subsequent file needs to be more complicated, a union all select, and specifying the name of the workbook we're getting our data from. So just to be able to distinguish between the first file and each subsequent file, there are several ways we can do this, but I'm going to use a basic Boolean variable like a switch or a toggle to detect whether I'm on the first file. So I'm going to declare a variable called isFirstFile and set the data type of that to Boolean. Just before I begin my loop then, I'm going to say isFirstFile equals true. And then inside the loop, after I've printed out the name of my movie file name, but before I do anything to the SQL string, I'm going to check if, excuse me, I'll spell if correctly. You wouldn't have thought I could have gotten that wrong, but I did. If isFirstFile, then I'm going to set SQL string to be equal to select star from sheet 1. So in fact, I'm just going to copy that line and then paste it in and make sure I close a set of double quotes at the end. Once I've done that for the first time through the loop, I want to make sure that the next time I go through the loop, isFirstFile is false. So at this point I can say isFirstFile equals false. So that will only happen the first time through the loop. I can then add an else clause, and then I'm going to indent my SQL string line in by one tab space, and then add my end if statement just after that. And what I want to do then is set my SQL string to be equal to, let's just take away the bit we copied previously, the initial select star from sheet 1. And I want to build on the SQL string. I don't just want to replace the content of that variable, I want to make it equal to itself and the next bit of text. So we'll make the variable equal to itself and then concatenate the remaining parts. Now we need to, of course, modify this part of our string here. We're not always going to go for the Movies 2012 workbook. So let's just take all that part away. Now remember, you must still include the open single quote and the closing single quote here. But I'm just going to take that part away and close a set of double quotes just in front of the single quotes. So that will be the very end of the string. And then before that, we're going to have my file's path and movie file name. So whatever current file name is held in that variable. So that will be going through the loop, of course, each time. And then simply concatenate the end of that string to the SQL string variable. At this point, I'm just going to comment out the debug.print movie file name line. And then after we've finished looping, I'm going to say debug.print for the entire SQL string and see what we've constructed. I'll clear the contents of the immediate window and then run the subroutine. And what we should see in the immediate window is a bit of a long string of text, as you might expect. But the beginning is select everything from sheet 1. And then a union all select everything from sheet 1 in Wiesel answers VBA, blah, 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 all the way through to the Movies 2012 workbook, with that additional extension to determine what type of database we're looking at. And then another union all, selecting everything in that file, which is the Movies 2013 workbook, and so on until we reach the end of that string. So at this point, we just need to check that we can actually return that set of data into the worksheet. And I'll start by commenting out my debug.print statement and then uncommenting all the lines that I commented out earlier on. Having done that, just checking that I've only got, I've got an empty worksheet at the moment because I've been running my subroutine without repopulating the worksheet. But when we run the subroutine again, this time we should find that it's fully populated with all of the data from all of those files. So at this point, it's really just a case of playing around with the select statement to do a few more interesting things. For example, let's say we wanted to get our set of results sorted alphabetically by film name, rather than based on which order they come out of the individual files. To do that, we can add an order by clause to the very end of the entire SQL string. So once we've finished looping through the entire list of files, we can add a single order by clause by saying SQL string equals SQL string and then at the end of all that, in a set of double quotes, we can say order by and then refer to the column name that contains the values we want to sort. So let's say in this case it's the title column, so I'll put that in some square brackets. And you can optionally then say either ASC for ascending order or DESC for descending order. The default is ascending, but I'm going to put in the ASC keyword anyway. And if I run the subroutine again this time, we'll see our results come out sorted alphabetically by name rather than by date. Now let's say we wanted to filter our list of results to include only those films which received at least one Oscar nomination. This is a little trickier because each individual select statement involved in the entire sequence needs to have the same where clause added to it to make that work. So for a basic select statement like this one, we'd say at the end of this, where Oscar nominations is greater than 0 or greater than or equal to 1, whichever you prefer. And we'd need to do the same thing also at the end of the additional parameters there, the Excel 2012, so we'd need to include the where clause at the end of each union select. Now we don't have to do that in two different places because the way we've constructed our loop, if we just concatenate to the end of the existing SQL string within the loop, it will make sure the where clause goes in the correct place based on whether it was the first file or any other file. So again, after the end if statement, we can say SQL string equals SQL string, and then concatenate to that where, and then the name of the column, which was Oscar nominations, in a set of square brackets again. And this time I'll go for greater than 0. I can then close the double quotes, and then I can run the subroutine again, and this time we'll return a set of results where the only films we see are those with at least one nomination. We can include multiple criteria in the same where clause. So for example, let's say we wanted to see only the fantasy films which had received at least one Oscar nomination. To do that, we can head back to the Visual Basic Editor and then find our where clause and tag on to the end of that. We can use either the AND or the OR operator, and just in the same way as in VBA, if you use the OR operator, if either condition is met, then you'll get a result. With the AND operator, only if both conditions are met will you get a result. So in this case, it's definitely AND. I want Oscar nominated and fantasy. So in the square brackets, I can refer to the genre field or the genre column, and then check that that is equal to the word fantasy. Now strings have to be included in a set of single quotes again, so I'll put the word fantasy, if I can spell that, the word fantasy in some single quotes, and then run the subroutine one more time, and we'll end up with only the Oscar nominated fantasy films in the list. Now there are many more things we can do with SQL SELECT statements. Indeed, we've got an entire playlist dedicated to the topic, which I'll link to at the end of the video. But for now, I think that's sufficient to get an idea of the potential for this technique in VBA. Now remember that the particular way we've applied the technique here, using the union or union all select statements, relies on having all of your workbooks with the same structure, so the same sheet names and the same columns. But providing you've got that kind of setup, then this is a really nice way to avoid having to open and close the record set for each file that you're trying to extract your data from. So I hope you've enjoyed that one. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.